Hi, this is Chris from Prison for Kids, and welcome back to Weird Ass Books. So, it's been a long time since the last episode, I think almost 3 years, and I'd actually filmed quite a few more, but I wasn't happy with the results of those episodes for a number of reasons, and so I kind of just shelved them and had planned to do more, but as life goes, it wasn't able to happen. So here I am now with much longer hair because of these COVID times, and I figured I might as well just do some more episodes. One thing I've kind of been struggling with is who this show is for, in terms of, am I trying to attract people who have read these books before and want someone to discuss them in detail, in depth, in terms of plot? Or is it for people who've never read these books but are curious about them and don't want spoilers or deep plot insights, or basically spoilers? I'm going to try and walk a fine line there and find a balance between something useful for people who have read these books, but also something useful for people who haven't. So today I'm going to be talking about the author Thomas M. Disch. This is in no way going to be like a comprehensive review or discussion about his entire bibliography. I'm just going to be talking about 4 works that I've read. The first of which being his novel, The Genocides, from 1965. Then we have Camp Concentration from 1968, I believe. Yeah, 1968. The short story collection Fun with Your New Head, also from 1968, 334 from 1972, and On Wings of Song from 1978, which I actually don't have a copy of because it was the last book I took out from the library before COVID hit back in March of 2020. I got to return it later that summer, but I don't have a copy. But anyway, that'll be the last book I'm talking about. He has a lot more work, so again, this is not going to be a comprehensive discussion about his entire bibliography. I first learned about Thomas Disch because one of my favorite authors, Samuel R. Delany, had a short piece. I forget which publication it came from, but he recommended, I think, 4 or 5 novels that I think they were specifically science fiction novels that he was influenced by or that he really appreciated. Samuel Delany, and the book Dahlgren is one of my favorite books of all time. It's actually one of the episodes I shelved, and I'm going to do another long-form piece about it. I can't remember exactly what all of the novels were that he recommended, but I remember that one was The Female Man by Joanna Russ, who I'm going to also talk about at some point, and one was Camp Concentration by Thomas M. Disch. So I checked him out. Just some biographical notes about him. He was born in 1940 in Iowa, and he, as a young man, ended up in New York City and pursued writing there. He was an out gay writer. He's actually best known because he created a children's story called The Brave Little Toaster, which actually became a animated series, I think in the 80s. And that's probably how I had first heard about him without knowing I had heard about him, because I did see a VHS of The Brave Little Toaster in a video store in the 90s, and I just thought it was a hilarious name for a kid's movie, a surrealist title. But anyway, he's an incredibly underrated writer, although people in the science fiction and to a lesser extent the horror community, I think, really embrace him. But I think he deserves a lot more recognition. I think he's unknown to a lot of contemporary audiences, but he has been nominated for and won a lot of awards over the years, including being nominated for Hugos and Nebulas. So again, if you're big into science fiction, you've at least heard of him probably. What really spoke to me about him among a lot of the other new wave of science fiction writers is that he had a cynical and a kind of sarcastic, witty tone, but without going into full misanthropy, he had a beating heart full of compassion, I think, underneath a lot of it. And his prose is beautiful because he was also a poet, and he actually was involved with early video games and theater. The one thing I'll say about all the works that I'm going to discuss today is that if it's really important for you to like the characters in a novel, the main characters or any characters really, not necessarily identify with them, but you want them to be virtuous and kind of like Harry Potter's or Luke Skywalker's, you're not going to get that from him. There's a lot of unlikable characters, and oftentimes the protagonists in his books, they're flawed to the point where I wouldn't begrudge you if you had to put the book down because it's not entertaining for you or not your cup of tea. But for me, I'm really interested in flawed narrators and flawed main characters. Not exclusively, but I always find it interesting when there's a flawed narrator or unreliable narrator in a piece of fiction. And one other biographical anecdote I just wanted to mention is that he was friends with Philip K. Dick, or at least pen pals. I don't know if they actually met. I haven't found that information directly, but apparently when Philip K. Dick read Camp Concentration, he actually reported Disch to the FBI. He saw signs and meaning in everything, even if there was nothing there. So I just thought that was a funny anecdote. Philip K. Dick, Philip K. Prick. So I'm going to start with The Genocides from 1965, which is his first novel. The book is about a rural area. I think it's in the Midwest. I can't remember exactly, but it's a rural area, farm area, and it's essentially an alien invasion story. It's incredibly dark and visceral, and again, this has almost no likable characters. In fact, every character is kind of awful in most ways. So the Earth starts getting sort of seeded with these plants, these giant plants. It's been a while since I've read this, so what I remember is them being like massive trunks, stalks that rise up, and they are absorbing all the nutrients that the other surrounding flora and fauna need. So the story is kind of about this family of farmers, and then also about these kind of vagabonds who encounter a different kind of alien, which are these spherical, kind of metallic spherical creatures that have fire rays or like laser beams and can just incinerate anything they want. So I don't want to spoil too much about this novel, but it's a very dark alien invasion tale that is just brutally exploring how things would play out in this rural area. It's really full of violence and dark thoughts. There's some incredibly claustrophobic and disturbing sequences that I thought were just so powerful in their visceral description. And I haven't read any of his like strictly horror work, but I can see how he can give you more nightmares than someone even than like Stephen King, because of how claustrophobic some of this stuff is and how disturbing, which felt really realistic to me about how things would play out against an alien invasion. And it reminded me of a quote from Stanley Kubrick that he said, I think this was around the time he was doing 2001. I'm paraphrasing. The true horror of the universe is not that it's malicious, but that it's indifferent. And that's something that I think is reflected in this novel, even though it came out before 2001. This alien invasion is just totally indifferent to humanity. There's no pleading, there's no appeals to emotion. It's just a brutally indifferent invasion. A lot of the horror of this book comes from how insignificant it makes humanity and the plight of humanity seem. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Camp Concentration from 1968. This book is often compared to Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, and there are definitely parallels because the main crux of the story is that it's about a person who is given intense cognitive abilities and then slowly deteriorates. But the context of this book is, I think, much more complex in that it was written around the time of the height of Vietnam, and the speculative fiction part of it is that the United States just goes hard into war with all countries, essentially, that they perceive to be communist sympathizers. So the United States is at war with all these countries, and as such, any conscientious objectors are imprisoned. And our main character is named Louis Sacchetti, and he is a conscientious objector. He's a poet. So the military throws him into this prison called Archimedes. And what they're doing to the prisoners in this facility is they're injecting them with a form of syphilis that causes hyperintelligence for a period of about 9 months to a year, at which point it causes the patient to just completely deteriorate into madness and then ultimately death. So the novel is told from the point of view of Sacchetti. So you're getting a first-person like diary entries into his process of becoming hyper-intelligent and then deteriorating. When you get that first-person perspective, you really get a picture into his madness and his rise and fall. This is a novel that I would highly recommend having a dictionary with, because he's using all sorts of $10 words, that many of which I had no clue what they meant and had to look up as I was reading. The most interesting thing about this novel is that you are getting a picture into madness and a deterioration of madness. So if you are someone who is really interested in writing, to call it an exercise seems patronizing or diminishing of what it is, but it's a really fascinating look at how someone would write from a diary perspective, someone going insane in a manically intelligent way and then declining. This was the book that Delaney recommended when I first heard about Thomas Disch, and I was actually kind of disappointed because I read The Genocides first, and the visceral horror of that book, I kind of wanted more of that. The conceit of the book was really interesting, but it didn't really I didn't feel like it was more than the sum of its parts, even though it's like a really great book and I highly recommend it. I'm just quibbling here with my experience of going from the Genocides to this book. It didn't have that visceral punch in the gut and like give me nightmares, which I guess that's a good thing. I don't know. I liked getting the nightmares from the first book. Next, I'm going to talk about Fun with Your New Head, also from 1968. So Disch was busy. This is a short story collection, and I think you can look at these as more disturbing Twilight Zone episodes. There's a bit of a darker bent, and it's not so twist dependent, but they're really sort of pithy, dark fables. You could also kind of compare it to stuff by Edgar Allan Poe, I think. Some of my favorite stories from this collection are the first story, which is called The Roaches. And if you've ever lived in an apartment building that's had a roach problem, or if you've ever had neighbors that were obnoxious and you could hear through the walls and you imagined all sorts of weird things about them, plus the roaches, this is a story that's probably going to affect you. The basic premise is that this woman is living in this apartment building, and even though she's really clean, she starts to notice roaches invading her place, and she kind of sort of makes a prayer or a pact with the roaches and gets control over them. And that's probably giving away too much. I might edit this out, but yeah, great little short story. Another story I really enjoyed is the second story, Come to Venus, Melancholy, which is a first-person tale of a computer that's been abandoned and is slowly going insane. So like Camp Concentration, it's this first-person narrative that is the moment-to-moment experience of a computer that is deteriorating and has been abandoned. Another story I really enjoyed from this collection was called Casablanca. It really reminded me of a story by J.G. Ballard from his collection, even though it came out about 10 years later, I think, called Having a Wonderful Time. This story is about an elderly couple that's having a vacation in Morocco, Casablanca, and shit hits the fan in terms of World War III, essentially. They're trapped on their vacation when the world is coming to an end. And the way in which this story is told, you kind of get a slow progression of how that would unfold. Again, that's a theme I keep coming back to with Disch. He likes to explore a slow deterioration of a normal state. One more story I wanted to mention was Descending. A down-and-out ne'er-do-well kind of guy is on an escalator, and at a certain point he realizes he's been on it for a long time, and then he realizes like it's going to go down forever and there's no way to get back up, and it just keeps going and going and going. It's just a great little Twilight Zone-esque piece. So yeah, Fun with Your New Head, 1968. The short story collection is a great way to start with Thomas M. Disch, because you're just getting these great little pieces of his psyche that are a window into someone who has, for sure, a sense of humor, but a dark sense of humor, and isn't afraid of the more unseemly aspects of human nature. Which brings me to 334 from 1972. This is a novel about a block in Manhattan. I forget the name of the exact street, but it's the 334 building. I think it's a real place in New York, or a real street. And it's sort of an anthology about the people who live in this building or in the area, including a family. And that conceit was what really drew me in. And actually, this was the first novel I really wanted to read from him, but I just ended up starting with the Genocides. And it's a near-future dystopian tale about the disintegration of society and kind of an extrapolation of where culture was heading if you had a really cynical point of view in the early 70s. So the 334 building is a housing project, and you're getting a slice of life from different people who live in the building and the people who live around it. I don't want to give away too much because there's some fascinating science fiction ideas or speculative fiction ideas, but the book has a lot to say about class, poverty, eugenics, drugs, morality. But ultimately, I was left a little bit cold by this book, not just because of the subject matter, which I knew was going to be cold, but I didn't feel like the elements were woven together. Maybe I wasn't quick enough to catch how all the elements were woven together in a way that was satisfying, or at least narratively compelling. I did feel like this was a great idea, a great premise for a novel. And I'm sure others have used it. I'm misremembering other authors who have also used a similar conceit where you're getting pieces from the people who live in a building. I know Chris Ware's comic books have done stuff like this, but maybe some of you YouTube people in the comments can remind me of other novels or anthologies where you're getting like a real sense of one building or one area. Yeah, 334 just has a lot to say about urban decay and the ways in which technology and society are deteriorating the human psyche, and at the same time it's incredibly funny, darkly funny. I think the humor might be lost on some, including me at some points. The point of view is incredibly bleak and absurdist at points. I actually prefer this to Camp Concentration overall, and I think it's a better novel than the Genocides, but for some reason the Genocides, just like I said before, punched me in the face, and the sense of visceral horror stayed with me longer than 334, although there are a few sequences in 334 now that I'm thinking about it that I do think about, including one in which, this is going to be a spoiler, but there's an interesting passage about a group of kids who just decide that they're going to murder a woman for no reason except they want to do it, which very much parallels Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. In fact, I think they name the woman that they're going to kill after the woman in Crime and Punishment that Raskolnikov kills. There's a lot of things that are sort of postmodern about the book and self-aware as well. Not quite to the point of metafiction, but in terms of referencing culture, referencing fiction especially. So yeah, 334, great novel. I'm going to finish today off with On Wings of Song from 1978. I don't have a copy of the novel here because, as I had mentioned before, I actually checked it out from the library right before COVID hit. I was grateful that I had the book throughout most of the first 6 months of COVID before Los Angeles Public Library allowed me to return it through a Dropbox. Anyway, I digress. I don't even live in Los Angeles anymore. But On Wings of Song, it was the book of his that I kind of was really looking forward to, and it is my favorite of his. Unfortunately, even if I did have a copy, 90% of the covers of this book are atrociously cheesy and terrible. And I know they say not to judge a book by its cover, but I think covers are so important for setting a mood, and I think authors really should, why not, seek out great art for their books. Because whenever I'm reading a book, when I finish a passage or I'm done reading for that period of time, you close the book, and I always look at the cover of the book, and I'm like, or I'm like, it does have a connection to you as a reader, even if it's just an aesthetic one. I think the phrase, don't judge a book by its cover, obviously is true, but there should be another corollary to that. Anyway, I digress. So On Wings of Song, 1978, you could call it a Bildungsroman or Bildungsroman, which is the German word for a coming-of-age story. Maybe you could call it a Roman éclair, which is a nonfiction tale with the names changed, although it's not really that. It's a fictional tale, but there's a lot that really parallels Thomas Disch's life, I think. Just from knowing superficially about him and his life, it seems really inspired by that, although it's a science fiction book, so clearly there's fiction. But the point at which you can say it parallels Disch's life is that the main character is from Iowa, he goes to the big city. But the real science fiction conceit of On Wings of Song is that there's this thing called flying, which occurs when you attach this device to your head. I think there's a crystal around your forehead or something like that. The conceit of the science fiction is, it's interesting, I'm going to get more into that, but the most important thing is that you sing in such a way, a transcendent way, that your spirit, your consciousness actually exits your body like an astral projection of sorts, and you become what's called in the novel a fairy, where you exist outside of your body. Your body is now just a husk. It's still supporting itself with oxygen, and if it's fed through a feeding tube, you'll survive, but for all intents and purposes, you are brain dead, but you exist in this astral projection outside your body, and you go on adventures or whatever. And oftentimes these fairies return to the body, and then the person comes back to their previous state. But sometimes people never come back, because when people do come back, they describe the state as being so ecstatic and so transcendent that coming back would kind of be pointless. So that's the main science fiction conceit, and there's a lot of sort of tertiary things about that, including that there are people who don't like these fairies, so they set traps for them, and the fairies can be trapped by repetitive drone sounds like motors or fans. And so people set traps for fairies in which these fairies just spend eternity mesmerized by these drones or fans or things like that. So that is the main science fiction conceit, although there are many scattered throughout. And the thing that's really interesting about this book is that Disch presents the science fiction elements in such a tangential way, or he kind of just brushes over them, even though they're sort of important to the story. Most science fiction writers would really labor themselves to explain how these things work, or the plot would revolve around them in a way in which is just like so traditional in science fiction. But Disch sort of treats them like the story is about the character and his journey, and the science fiction elements are sort of dressing, even though they do have an effect on the plot. They're not, it's just a fascinating way to kind of obliquely present science fiction elements that I thought was really compelling. I think other people who are science fiction fans might have an issue with how little he explains about how these things work and how they operate. But at the same time, I think about my cell phone, or I think about my television, and like, I know what an LCD is, I know about computers, but I don't really, essentially it's magic to me. And if I really wanted to delve deep into it, I could probably understand how all these things work. But if you told a contemporary story and someone uses their cell phone, you're not going to explain how the cell phone works if you're writing a normal fiction novel, right? And similarly, Disch doesn't explain all the elements. Anyway, that's a long digression. The story is about a character named Daniel Weintraub. He's a young man, and you follow his coming of age, the Bildungsroman. He is a young man in Iowa. His father is a dentist. And, you usually would associate a dentist with being an upper middle class or upper class person, but his dad is kind of on the down and out. And then he's Jewish in Iowa, which has become like a conservative enclave. And there's a strict divide in the society at the time, which kind of mirrors what's happening today, where there are very religious reactionary people and more cosmopolitan people living in the cities. And the people in the conservative areas hate the idea of flying. They think it's anathema, to the point where they don't even like people singing normally, because it could lead to people trying to fly and achieve this kind of transcendence, which you could say has a lot of parallels with like the hippie movement and tuning in, turning on, and dropping out. But anyway, Daniel, his mother, abandoned the family when he was young because she learned how to fly and kind of joined a counterculture, kind of hippie-esque group. But then she wants to rejoin the family. And that's kind of the beginning of the book. And then Daniel goes on a journey. I don't want to spoil all the plot points, but it involves the prison industrial complex. It involves cultural appropriation, poverty, and living in New York. What I really loved about this novel is it's preoccupied with transcendence. And Daniel wants to be a singer. He wants to be someone who's able to sing and leave his body with this technology, partly because his mother did it, and you could make ties to that, but also because, living in such a dark dystopian present for him, even though it's like sort of set in the near future for when it was written in 1978, you can understand that desire to transcend your body and your mind and to enter some kind of more celestial state of consciousness. And the book is just so beautifully written. I really felt the prose on this book because he is able to weave in like very beautiful poetic imagery, but keeps the plot going in a way that is so compelling. And I read it so quickly because of that. Truly one of the best novels I've ever read, I think in my top 50 easily. And there's lots of twists and turns in the plot, which I don't want to spoil, because I really think almost more than some of the other books I read or I'm going to talk about, where plot is not as instrumental or important as the feeling or the mood or the literary and metafictional aspects. On Wings of Song is a beautifully plot-driven but wonderfully written book. So Thomas M. Disch, a great writer, very dark, very funny. So if you have a dark sense of humor, but you also aren't a total misanthrope, I would highly recommend his work. And I'm excited to check out more of his stuff. And if any of you want to recommend stuff of his in the comments, I would love to hear it. And please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you are really into music, especially vinyl, check out my bandmate Cesar's show, Vinyl Roulette. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Weird Ass Books.